What occurs when the final penalty transforms into the ultimate spectacle of failure? Across centuries, executions were designed to be swift, decisive events, serving as stark deterrents to all who watched. They were meticulously staged demonstrations of governmental authority, intended to convey the delivery of justice with unemotional, sharp precision. Yet, on occasion, the entire process would unravel into catastrophic disarray. Imagine yourself as an ordinary person in a medieval town square, gathered with a crowd to see a swift, efficient beheading. The convicted is brought forth, the sentence is read, and a grim silence falls. You expect the flash of steel, a single, clean strike, and then the somber conclusion. But that's not what happens. Instead, you witness a scene of pure terror as the executioner, axe in hand, bungles the first blow, then finds himself pursuing his wounded, screaming victim across the scaffold. The solemn display of justice descends into a barbaric chase. Or picture being in attendance at the very first execution by electric chair, a method hailed as the dawn of humane capital punishment. You anticipate a quick, scientific end, but instead, the air fills with the sickening smell of burning flesh as the condemned individual's body ignites during a horrifically mismanaged attempt at a merciful death. These calamitous events often irrevocably altered the trajectory of execution techniques. They stripped away the veneer of civilized justice, revealing the savage reality that lay beneath society's efforts to kill with dignity. These failures frequently became the catalyst for reforms that would ultimately lead to the end of public executions entirely. Prepare to delve into the executions that went so dreadfully awry they became more horrifying than the crimes that led to them, tales of when the blade meant to deliver a final judgment could not find its target. When discussing botched decapitations, two cases are forever etched into the chronicles of execution disasters: Margaret Pole and Mary, Queen of Scots. Both women were of royal lineage. Both were condemned to face the executioner's block, and both met ends so appallingly mismanaged that the accounts of those present would echo through history. Let's begin with Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, in the year 1541. At 67, she stood as one of the last remnants of the Plantagenet dynasty, the line that had ruled England before the Tudors. This lineage made her a potent symbol of potential rebellion, and for that, King Henry VIII, a monarch known for his ruthless consolidation of power, condemned her to death for treason. The core of the problem, however, lay with the executioner appointed for her sentence. He was not a seasoned professional but a complete novice. Historical records speculate he may have been a hastily recruited volunteer, as the official executioner reportedly refused the task of killing an elderly noblewoman. The scene that followed was one of nightmarish incompetence. When directed to lay her head upon the block, Margaret Pole defiantly refused. She famously declared, "So should traitors do, and I am none." She would not cooperate with her own murder. This act of defiance shattered the composure of the inexperienced executioner. Already on edge, he took his first swing. It was a wild, miscalculated blow that missed her neck completely, striking her between the shoulder and the neck, leaving a horrific gash on the back of her head. Incomprehensibly, Margaret, now covered in her own blood, did not collapse. Fueled by adrenaline and terror, she scrambled to her feet and began to run around the scaffold. What was intended to be a solemn, grim proceeding devolved into a grotesque chase. The executioner, wielding his heavy axe, pursued the elderly countess, hacking at her like a butcher. With each frantic swing, he landed another wound, on her shoulders, her back, her arms. It was a chaotic and brutal spectacle. Onlookers, who had gathered to see justice served, instead saw a frenzied slaughter. They counted at least 11 distinct blows before the 67-year-old woman's body finally gave out and she collapsed, dead from a bloody combination of shock and exsanguination. The crowd was left traumatized. Reports from the time described people vomiting and fleeing the scene in terror. Even hardened Tudor courtiers, men accustomed to violence, labeled it the most barbaric execution they had ever seen. Yet, the horror of Margaret Pole's death was merely a prelude to the fiasco that would befall Mary, Queen of Scots, 46 years later. Mary's execution in 1587 was meticulously planned to be a powerful and unambiguous display of Queen Elizabeth's justice against her rival. It was meant to be flawless, a symbol of Tudor strength and stability. Instead, it became a theater of the macabre, a series of errors so grotesque it left even the executioner shaken. The first strike of the axe was horribly misplaced, hitting the back of Mary's head instead of her neck. A low groan escaped her lips, a sound that witnesses claimed seemed to reverberate through the chilling silence of the great hall. The executioner, now in a state of panic, hastily raised his axe for a second attempt. This blow was more effective, severing most of her neck, but not entirely. Her head was still attached to her body by a stubborn piece of sinew. A third, sawing motion with the axe was required to finally complete the gruesome task. But the true moment of horror was yet to unfold. As was the custom, the executioner bent down to pick up the severed head to display it to the assembled witnesses, shouting the traditional proclamation, "God save the Queen." As he triumphantly raised what he thought was Mary's head, something went terribly wrong. The head he held was suddenly much lighter, and he was left holding only an auburn wig with a few blood-soaked strands caught in his grasp. Mary's actual head, graying, balding, and gruesomely separated, had fallen from the wig and rolled across the wooden scaffold floor, coming to a rest some feet away from her body. To the absolute horror of everyone present, her lips were reportedly still moving for several seconds after. The great hall was plunged into a deafening, stunned silence. Then, a single person screamed, and the sound spread like a contagion through the horrified crowd. Even the Dean of Peterborough, who was in the middle of reading prayers for the condemned queen, faltered and stared in open-mouthed shock. The disaster of Margaret Pole's execution led to reforms, including stricter requirements for the training of executioners. Mary's bungled beheading, in turn, fueled the growing sentiment among the English nobility against the spectacle of public executions altogether. Fire, failure, and a spectacular collapse. Let's travel to Florence in the year 1498. This was the heart of the Renaissance, the city that gifted the world Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. Yet, it was also on the verge of hosting one of the most profoundly embarrassing execution failures in all of Italian history. The man at the center of it all was Girolamo Savonarola, the ferociously zealous Dominican friar who had radically transformed the city with his stringent religious dictates and his infamous bonfire of the vanities. Savonarola was the charismatic and terrifying preacher who had persuaded the citizens of Florence to cast their mirrors, fine clothing, musical instruments, artworks, and any object he declared to be a temptation to sin into massive public fires. Now, in a twist of supreme irony that escaped no one, it was his turn to be consumed by flames. The city authorities, eager to erase the monk's influence, planned a public burning that would rival the very spectacles he had created. A colossal wooden platform was constructed in the Piazza della Signoria, the very square where Savonarola had once held his most powerful rallies, drawing thousands to his cause. On the day of the execution, the piazza was crammed with people, a massive crowd eager to witness the final downfall of the man who had exerted such total control over their lives for years. This was meant to be a masterclass in political theater. However, a critical oversight had been made. Nobody had bothered to properly inspect the structural integrity of the execution platform. As Savonarola and his two condemned companions, fellow friars, were marched onto the platform and secured to their respective posts, the proceedings seemed to be unfolding exactly as planned. A hush fell over the crowd. Then, without warning, the entire structure gave way. It didn't creak or groan, it simply collapsed all at once with a deafening crash that echoed across the square. Savonarola, still bound to his post, plunged down into the heap of firewood and splintered timbers below. In an instant, the crowd's bloodthirsty anticipation turned into a collective, stunned silence. This was not part of the script. State executions, particularly for figures of such importance, were designed to project an image of smooth, inescapable authority. What the Florentines were watching looked less like the grim administration of justice and more like a scene from a bumbling comedy. A wave of panic and confusion washed over the officials. They scrambled to decide on a course of action. Should they simply set fire to the wreckage where it lay? Should they postpone the entire event and attempt it again the next day? All the while, Savonarola lay amid the debris, perhaps contemplating whether this was a sign of divine intervention or simply a spectacular failure of Italian engineering. The officials chose to improvise. Rather than spend hours rebuilding the platform, they hastily rearranged the wreckage into a makeshift pyre directly on the ground. They resecured the 3 condemned men to whatever wooden posts remained upright in the jumble. The result was a chaotic mess that bore no resemblance to the dignified, imposing execution they had envisioned. When they finally managed to light the fire, the haphazard pile of wood burned erratically. Some areas erupted in intense flames, while other sections merely smoldered, releasing thick plumes of smoke. The smoke, instead of rising in a majestic column, swirled unpredictably at ground level, choking the front rows of the crowd. Instead of leaving the Piazza della Signoria discussing the righteousness of the verdict, the people of Florence left talking about incompetent carpenters and the city's embarrassing lack of planning. Savonarola's execution disaster became a famous cautionary tale that circulated throughout Renaissance Italy. In its wake, other cities instituted new regulations, requiring mandatory structural inspections for execution platforms and demanding backup plans in case of primary system failure. The friar who had built his power on meticulously orchestrated public spectacles had, in his death, inadvertently created one final, unforgettable spectacle, just not the kind anyone had intended. Fast forward 4 centuries to August 6, 1890. The world was poised to witness a revolution in capital punishment. Scientists and politicians had championed a new method they promised would be the most humane form of execution ever conceived. No more of the bloody mess of beheadings or the grim uncertainty of hangings. This was the age of science, and the future was clean, instantaneous death by electricity. The condemned man was William Kemmler, a produce vendor from Buffalo who had murdered his common-law wife with a hatchet in a drunken rage. But Kemmler was destined to be remembered as far more than just another killer. He was to be the first human test subject for society's most advanced attempt at a civilized execution. The electric chair was a product of the era's greatest minds. Even Thomas Edison had been a proponent of electrical execution, although his motives were complex. He promoted it partly to demonstrate that the alternating current, AC, championed by his competitor, George Westinghouse, was dangerously lethal and therefore unsuitable for public use. The chair itself looked formidable. Built of solid oak with leather straps and polished brass fittings, it had the appearance of a piece of furniture from a wealthy gentleman's study rather than an instrument of death. A group of 25 witnesses, a mix of doctors, reporters, and state officials, packed into the small execution chamber. They were there to see history made, to witness the first step toward a future where the death penalty would be administered with swift, painless, and dignified precision. What they experienced instead was a grotesque nightmare that would traumatize many of them for the rest of their lives. Kemmler was strapped into the chair, with electrodes attached to his shaved head and his lower back to create a circuit through his body. At the warden's signal, the executioner threw the switch. A current of 1,000 volts surged through William Kemmler's body for 17 agonizing seconds. His body convulsed violently and then fell still. The attending physician checked for a pulse and confidently announced, "He is dead." But he wasn't. A moment later, to the horror of everyone in the room, William Kemmler gasped for breath. What unfolded next was a scene of pure pandemonium. Kemmler's chest began to rise and fall in shallow breaths. A low groaning sound escaped his lips, and foam began to form at his mouth. Sheer panic erupted among the officials. This was impossible. The science was supposed to be perfect. The calculations had been precise. Dead men were not supposed to start breathing again. In a desperate frenzy, they decided they had to electrocute him a second time. The executioner threw the switch once more, this time sending a much stronger current, 2,000 volts, surging through Kemmler for a much longer duration. The result was more horrific than anything a medieval torturer could have devised. The first thing the witnesses noticed was the smell, the unmistakable, sickeningly sweet odor of burning human flesh. Smoke began to curl from the top of Kemmler's head. The immense electrical current was literally cooking him from the inside out. Then his hair burst into flames, and his clothes began to smolder. The brass fittings on the chair became so hot they started to burn through the leather restraints. The room filled with a thick, acrid smoke. One reporter from the New York World newspaper retched violently and had to be helped from the chamber. A physician present to observe the supposedly humane procedure later wrote, "It was the most revolting spectacle I have ever witnessed." When it was finally over, after a horrifying ordeal that lasted a full 8 minutes from start to finish, William Kemmler was certainly dead. But so was the electric chair's reputation as a clean and humane method of execution. The newspapers ran sensational headlines. George Westinghouse, whose AC current had been used to carry out the ghastly procedure, commented with biting sarcasm, "They could have done better with an axe." The 4-hour torture. We arrive in Paris on March 28, 1757. The scene is the place to grieve, and what was about to transpire there would go down as the most notoriously bungled execution in the history of France. It was a spectacle of such prolonged horror that it would leave an entire city traumatized and serve as a powerful catalyst for the eventual abolition of public torture in the nation. The condemned was Robert François Damiens. He had committed the most grievous offense imaginable against the French monarchy. He had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV. In truth, his attack was pathetically inept. He had managed to inflict only a superficial scratch on the king with a small penknife. But in the absolute monarchy of 18th century France, where the king's body was considered sacred and inviolable, even a failed attempt at regicide was the ultimate crime. It demanded the most extreme and symbolically devastating punishment the legal system could possibly inflict. The sentence was death by dismemberment. Damiens was to be taken to the public square, where each of his 4 limbs would be tied to a powerful horse, and he would be literally torn apart while still alive. This was an ancient and brutal form of execution, reserved for the most heinous of criminals, such as those who dared to threaten the crown. Its purpose was twofold: to inflict maximum suffering and to serve as a terrifyingly powerful symbol. The criminal's body would be utterly destroyed, his remains scattered, serving as an unmistakable warning to any who might harbor similar thoughts. Thousands of spectators flooded the square, a grimly festive atmosphere taking hold. Members of the nobility had even paid exorbitant prices for rooms and balconies with the best views of the proceedings. But from the very outset, the meticulously planned spectacle of state power began to fall apart. The first sign of trouble appeared when the executioners brought out the horses. The 4 animals chosen for this grisly task were supposed to be immensely powerful draft horses, capable of exerting the enormous force needed to rip a man apart. Instead, the animals brought forth looked more like weary carriage horses, clearly past their prime and visibly unequal to the task before them. Damiens was stretched out on the ground, his arms and legs securely tied with ropes to the 4 horses. The chief executioner gave the signal, and the handlers urged the horses to pull. A wave of anticipation swept through the crowd as they held their breath, ready to witness the swift, terrible justice of the king. Nothing happened. The horses strained, their muscles bunching, but Damiens's body, though stretched to an agonizing degree, remained stubbornly intact. Rather than pulling in a coordinated, powerful surge, the horses seemed confused, pulling ineffectually in different directions. Minutes stretched into an hour. The horses continued their futile tugging while Damiens lay on the ground, fully conscious, enduring unimaginable pain, but frustratingly, still in one piece. The crowd, which had come expecting a dramatic and bloody climax, grew restless and agitated. Officials gathered in panicked huddles, desperately trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. Some argued for bringing in a different, stronger team of horses. Others suggested simply adding more horses to the existing 4. All the while, Damiens was being subjected to a slow-motion torture session. His joints were being gradually pulled past their breaking point, but not with enough force to actually separate. It was the torment of a medieval rack, but performed in public, in front of thousands, as a botched execution. After 2 excruciating hours of this grotesque display, the officials decided they had to intervene. They brought forth long knives and began the gruesome task of manually cutting Damien's tendons and ligaments at the joints, hoping to weaken the connections enough for the exhausted horses to finally finish the job. This act transformed the event from a symbolic demonstration of royal authority into a visceral public butchery. The cutting helped, but it still wasn't enough. The horses resumed their pulling, while Damien's, now bleeding profusely from multiple deep wounds, remained shockingly conscious and aware. Witnesses later reported that he was still moving and making sounds, still undeniably alive. Finally, after more than 4 agonizing hours and with the addition of 2 more horses to the team, Damien's body at last gave way. But even then, the end was not the clean dismemberment that had been planned. His limbs came apart one by one in a prolonged, horrific process that left everyone, from the executioners to the spectators, deeply traumatized by what they had seen. The disaster of Damien's execution became a pivotal moment in French culture. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire seized upon the event, using it as a prime example of the barbaric cruelty of the old regime and arguing for fundamental judicial reform. The horrific spectacle directly fueled the growing movement for the abolition of torture and the search for more humane punishments, ironically helping to undermine the very monarchical system it was meant to protect. Finally, when mercy died with the condemned. In Tudor England, public executions were a common and brutal reality. But what was about to happen to Anthony Babington and his co-conspirators in 1586 would violate even the hardened sensibilities of a Tudor crowd. The Babington plot was one of the most serious threats Elizabeth I had ever faced, a conspiracy to assassinate her and place her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. The Queen wanted the punishment to be as severe as the crime. The sentence was the full horror of high treason, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. But a crucial, deliberate modification would turn this execution from a standard display of state justice into a spectacle of cruelty that horrified London. Babington and his fellow plotters were to be cut down from the gallows while still fully alive and conscious, then disemboweled and dismembered before their own eyes. In theory, this was not entirely new. Standard procedure for traitors was to hang them until they were almost dead, rendering them unconscious or close to it before the horrific quartering began. It was a fine line, a small measure of mercy within an act of ultimate brutality. But someone in power, whether it was Elizabeth herself or one of her vengeful advisors, decreed that Babington and his inner circle deserved no such mercy. The first 7 conspirators, led by Anthony Babington, were brought to the scaffold. The London crowd was enormous, hungry to see the fate of the men who had tried to kill their queen. They expected a brutal show, but they assumed it would follow the grim but familiar routine. They were wrong. Anthony Babington was the first to be hanged. He was suspended for the shortest possible time, just long enough to inflict pain before being cut down, ensuring he was completely awake and aware for what came next. What followed shattered every unwritten rule of Tudor executions. While fully conscious, Babington was sliced open. The executioner pulled out his internal organs and cast them into a nearby fire as Babington watched. Then came the dismemberment, his arms and legs hacked off while he was still alive enough to feel every blow. The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive. These were not sensitive people, they were accustomed to the sight of death and punishment. But this was a level of cruelty that crossed a line they hadn't known existed. A roar of protest went up. People began shouting for the executioner to stop, demanding that Babington be killed before the butchery continued. Some reports even claimed that members of the crowd tried to rush the scaffold to put an end to the torture themselves. The execution, meant to solidify Elizabeth's power, was rapidly turning into a public relations catastrophe. But the day's gruesome work was not over. However, between the execution of the first group and the second, something extraordinary occurred. Word of the crowd's furious reaction reached Queen Elizabeth. A masterful politician with a keen sense of public opinion, she made a rare and decisive mid-execution intervention. She sent a message to the scaffold. The remaining conspirators were to be allowed to hang until they were fully dead before the quartering could begin. This last-minute royal modification of a sentence being actively carried out was almost unheard of. But the public revulsion at Babington's conscious dismemberment was so potent that even the Queen knew it had gone too far. The Babington plot executions became a stark lesson for the Tudor government about the limits of performative cruelty, proving that even in an age of brutal spectacle, there were boundaries of horror that, once crossed, could threaten the very authority they were meant to uphold.